September 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand that absorbed sound, hope, and the conviction that any of this mattered. Italian Sergeant Vittorio Marchetti stood at the edge of a supply trench, watching the horizon shimmer in waves of heat that made the distant British positions look like mirages. He was 31 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of most men in his battalion. Too old to believe the propaganda that played from loudspeakers at headquarters. Too young to refuse when his country called him to war. The sun was a white disk burning overhead, turning metal too hot to touch and sand into something that could blind you if you stared at it wrong. The smell was always the same: diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, cordite from the morning's shelling, and underneath it all, the faint metallic scent of blood that never quite left once you'd been in the desert long enough. Marchetti lit a cigarette with hands that had stopped shaking months ago. His unit, part of the Italian Ariete Division, had been fighting alongside Rommel's Afrika Corps for nearly 2 years. They had pushed deep into Egypt, come within striking distance of Alexandria, and watched the British retreat again and again until it seemed the war would be won simply by walking forward. But walking forward had become harder lately. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Food was scarce. Water was rationed to amounts that left throats perpetually dry. The Germans received priority for everything: fuel, ammunition, medical supplies. Italian soldiers made do with what was left, which was rarely enough. Marchetti's men had learned to scavenge British positions after each engagement, not for intelligence but for food. Tea was a luxury. Tinned meat was a feast. Once they found chocolate, and grown men had wept over the taste of something sweet. He looked at his platoon now, scattered along the trench line, most of them sleeping in whatever shade they could find. Giovanni, barely 18, from a village outside Rome. Domenico, who had been a fisherman in Sicily and still smelled faintly of the sea even after months in the desert. Alberto, the only one among them who still believed Italy would win. They trusted Marchetti because he had kept them alive longer than most officers managed to keep their men alive. He didn't lead charges into machine gun fire. He didn't follow orders that made no tactical sense. He evaluated, calculated, and preserved lives whenever possible. Which was becoming increasingly difficult. The British had reinforced. Everyone knew it. Supply convoys rolled into their positions night after night, visible in the distance as long lines of headlights moving east to west. The Americans had joined the war and their equipment was starting to appear on the battlefield: tanks with better armor, artillery with longer range, planes that controlled the sky. Meanwhile, Italian supplies came sporadically, delivered by convoys that were bombed by the RAF, strafed by fighters, or simply diverted to German units who received priority. Morale was a ghost of what it had been a year ago. Marchetti's orders were clear. Hold this position. Prevent British reconnaissance. Maintain defensive readiness. The language of warfare that meant sit here and wait for someone to decide your fate. He knew what was coming. Any soldier with eyes could see it. The British weren't retreating anymore. They were preparing. And when they came, it would be with overwhelming force against an army that was starving, undersupplied, and increasingly convinced that Rome had forgotten they existed. But for now the desert was quiet. A lizard moved across the sand near Marchetti's boot, its body rippling in quick, efficient movements. He watched it disappear into a crack in the earth, gone so quickly it might never have existed. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, he could see British positions. Somewhere over there, men just like his were eating better food, drinking cleaner water, and preparing for an offensive that would break the Axis lines like glass under a hammer. Marchetti finished his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. The sun moved incrementally across the sky. Time passed the way it always did in the desert, slowly and then all at once. He didn't know yet that in 3 weeks he would make a choice that would redefine everything he understood about duty, honor, and the arbitrary lines that separated enemy from friend. For now, he simply stood watch, another Italian soldier holding a position that would soon cease to exist. October 23, 1942. 2,140 hours. The world ended in fire and thunder. Marchetti was dozing when the first barrage hit. One moment he was somewhere between sleep and waking, his mind wandering through memories of home. The next moment, the ground was shaking so violently he couldn't tell which way was up. The British had opened their offensive with 1,000 guns firing simultaneously along a 6-mile front. The sound wasn't just noise, it was physical force, a pressure wave that crushed the air from your lungs and left your ears ringing so badly that silence became impossible to imagine. Shells screamed overhead in continuous waves. The desert lit up like daylight as explosions walked across Italian positions with methodical precision. Dust and smoke rose in thick clouds that turned the night into something from a nightmare, lit from below by muzzle flashes and burning vehicles. Marchetti's trench collapsed on one side, sending sand and debris cascading into the space where 3 of his men had been sleeping. He dug frantically with his hands, shouting names he couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. Giovanni emerged first, coughing, his face white with shock. Then Domenico, bleeding from a cut across his forehead but alive. They pulled at the sand together, knowing someone else was down there, knowing they had seconds before another shell landed. Alberto's hand appeared first, then his shoulder. They hauled him out just as another explosion erupted 50 meters away, sending shrapnel singing through the air like hornets made of steel. Move! Move! Marchetti was screaming, though he couldn't hear his own voice. He pointed toward the secondary positions, hoping they were still intact, knowing this trench would be obliterated within minutes. They ran through a landscape transformed. Where there had been defensive positions, there were now craters. Where there had been supply dumps, there were fires bright enough to read by. Men stumbled past in the smoke, some wounded, some simply running, all of them trying to escape an artillery barrage that had no escape. The British plan was devastatingly simple. Pummel Italian and German positions until resistance collapsed, then send infantry forward to clear what remained. Behind the infantry would come tanks, Shermans and Grants, dozens of them, more armor than the Axis forces could hope to stop. Marchetti's platoon made it to a deeper trench system just as the barrage intensified. They crouched against the walls, pressing themselves into the earth while the world came apart above them. Hours passed like years. The shelling never stopped, just shifted, moving across the battlefield in patterns that meant someone was directing it, someone was watching from a distance and calling coordinates to gunners who fired without ever seeing the men they were trying to kill. When dawn came, it arrived gray and dim through clouds of dust and smoke. The barrage had finally lifted, replaced by an even more terrifying sound: engines. Tanks. Marchetti risked a look over the trench edge and felt his stomach drop. British armor was advancing across the desert in lines that stretched as far as he could see. Behind them came infantry, thousands of men moving in coordinated waves that looked unstoppable. Italian artillery tried to respond, but their guns were few and poorly supplied. Each shell they fired made them a target for British counter-battery fire, which arrived with frightening accuracy. One by one, Italian gun positions fell silent. German panzers engaged the British advance, buying time, but there weren't enough of them. For every German tank that knocked out a British Sherman, two more appeared to take its place. The mathematics of attrition were devastatingly clear. "What are our orders?" Giovanni asked, his voice shaking. Marchetti looked at his platoon. 7 men. That's what remained from the 20 he'd started with the day before. 7 exhausted, terrified soldiers with maybe 3 magazines of ammunition each and no artillery support. Their orders were to hold the position. To delay the British advance. To die here if necessary, because headquarters needed time to establish new defensive lines further west. But Marchetti was looking at the advancing tanks and doing calculations. 7 men couldn't stop an army. They could barely slow down a single company. Staying here meant dying here, and dying here accomplished nothing except adding 7 more bodies to a desert that was already full of graves. "We fall back," he said. "Controlled retreat to the rally point." The orders were to hold, Alberto protested, still believing in the chain of command, still thinking that following orders mattered more than surviving. "The position is overrun," Marchetti said flatly. "Staying here accomplishes nothing. We fall back." They moved west, staying low, using every bit of cover the desert provided. Around them the battle raged. German and Italian units fought desperate rearguard actions, buying minutes with lives, watching the offensive roll over them like a wave over sand. The British had broken through. Everyone knew it. The question now wasn't whether the Axis line would collapse, but when and how many men would be captured or killed before it happened. Marchetti's platoon made it 3 kilometers before they encountered German military police establishing a new defensive line. An officer saw their Italian uniforms and immediately started shouting about cowards and deserters, about standing fast and doing your duty. Marchetti stared at him with eyes that had stopped caring about rank or protocol. "My orders were to delay the enemy. I delayed them. Now I'm here." The German officer looked like he wanted to argue, but another explosion erupted nearby, and he had more immediate problems than one Italian sergeant with insubordinate eyes. They were assigned to a new position. Given ammunition they couldn't spare. Told to prepare for the next British push, which was coming soon, possibly within hours. The desert had become a graveyard. Burned-out tanks. Abandoned equipment. Bodies that nobody had time to bury. The smell of cordite and death hung in the air like fog. Marchetti looked east, where black smoke rose in pillars against the sky. The illusion was over. The dream of victory had died somewhere in that barrage. What remained was survival, and survival meant learning very quickly that the rules they'd been taught no longer applied. November 2, 1942. Thought. The British were everywhere now, and the Axis army was coming apart. Marchetti's platoon had been separated from their battalion during another night retreat. They'd spent the darkness moving west, trying to avoid British patrols, trying to find their own lines in a desert where positions changed by the hour. When dawn came they were lost. They'd taken shelter in a wadi, a dried riverbed that provided the only cover for miles. The sun rose like a furnace being opened, and with it came the understanding that they were completely exposed. "We need water," Domenico said. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Everyone's were. Their canteens had been empty since the previous afternoon. Dehydration wasn't a threat anymore, it was a certainty. Without water they had maybe one more day before they started dying. There, Giovanni pointed. In the distance, perhaps half a kilometer away, they could see what looked like an abandoned British supply truck. It sat alone in the open desert, no troops nearby, no obvious reason why it had been left behind. Could be a trap, Alberto said. Could be water, Marchetti replied. They approached carefully, using whatever minimal cover the terrain provided, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of rifles or see British soldiers rise from hidden positions. But as they got closer, it became clear the truck wasn't a trap. It was a casualty. The vehicle had taken artillery fire. One wheel was blown off. The canvas cover was shredded. Supplies were scattered around it in the sand, ammunition boxes, fuel cans, and most importantly water containers. But there was something else. A man lay in the shade beside the truck. He wore a British uniform. Even from a distance, Marchetti could see the dark stain of blood across his midsection. "He's wounded," Giovanni whispered. "He's English," Alberto hissed. "Leave him." They moved closer. The British soldier was young, maybe 20, maybe younger. His face was pale beneath the desert tan, slick with sweat despite the morning cool. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The wound was bad. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, probably from the same shell that had destroyed the truck. He'd been bleeding for hours, maybe since the previous evening. Without medical attention he would die here. The soldier's eyes fluttered open. He looked at them with the dull confusion of someone floating in and out of consciousness. He saw their uniforms. Saw the Italian insignia. His hand moved weakly toward a pistol that lay in the sand just beyond his reach. "Don't," Marchetti said softly in English, the language he'd learned from his mother, who had once believed Italy and Britain would never fight. "We're not here to hurt you." The soldier's hand stopped moving. He stared at Marchetti with eyes that were trying to focus, trying to understand if this was real or some fever dream produced by blood loss and dehydration. "Water," the soldier whispered. Not a request. Just a statement of what his body needed most. Marchetti looked at his own men. They were staring at him, waiting to see what he would do. They had no water. This soldier was their enemy. Helping him meant nothing strategically, nothing tactically. It might even be dangerous. British patrols could be searching for this truck, could arrive at any moment. But the soldier was dying. Slowly. Painfully. And Marchetti found he couldn't walk away from that. "Get the water containers," he said to Giovanni. "Sergeant," Alberto started to protest. "Get the water." They found 3 containers intact, maybe 10 liters total. It was barely enough for 5 men for one day, but it was more water than they'd had an hour ago. Marchetti took one container, opened it, and knelt beside the British soldier. "Small sips," he said. "If you drink too fast you'll vomit." He helped the soldier drink, supporting his head, watching the Adam's apple move as water went down a throat that must have felt like sandpaper. The soldier drank maybe a cup's worth before Marchetti pulled the container away. "More?" the soldier whispered. "Later. Too much will make you sick." Marchetti examined the wound as best he could with no medical training and no supplies. The bleeding had mostly stopped, probably because the soldier's body was running out of blood to lose. The wound itself was infected, angry red tissue visible where cloth had been blown away. Without surgery, without antibiotics, without any kind of proper medical care, this man would die. But maybe not today. Maybe not in the next few hours. "What's your name?" Marchetti asked. "Thomas." The word came out as barely more than breath. "Private Thomas Webb. 8th Army. I'm Vittorio. Italian Army." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. "Ironic." "What is?" "Italian. Helping me. Thought you'd shoot me." "So did I," Alberto muttered in Italian, but Marchetti ignored him. "We're not going to shoot you, Thomas. But we can't stay here long. British patrols might come. German patrols definitely will. And if they find you..." He didn't need to finish. Thomas understood. The Germans weren't known for leaving wounded British soldiers in comfort. "Just leave me," Thomas said. "Got water now. Maybe patrol finds me. Maybe." Marchetti sat back on his heels, studying this young man who was trying very hard to be brave about dying in the middle of nowhere. He thought about his own orders: reach Italian lines, report for reassignment, continue fighting. Getting involved with a wounded enemy soldier complicated everything. It wasted time. It potentially compromised their position. It served no strategic purpose whatsoever. But he found himself not caring about strategic purpose. "Can you move?" Marchetti asked. Thomas blinked. "What? Can you move? If we help you, can you walk?" "Why would you?" "Because leaving you here is the same as shooting you. Just slower." Thomas stared at him. Around them, the desert was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of artillery that never stopped, that had become the permanent background noise of this place. "I don't understand," Thomas said. "Neither do I," Marchetti replied honestly. "But I'm not leaving you here." He turned to his platoon. They were watching him with expressions that ranged from confusion to anger. Only Giovanni looked like he might understand. "We take him with us," Marchetti said in Italian. "That's insane," Alberto said flatly. "He'll slow us down. He might die anyway. And if we're caught with him? If we're caught, we're prisoners regardless of whether we have him or not. The war is over, Alberto. The British won. We're just trying to stay alive until we can surrender properly. So we risk our lives for an Englishman? We risk our lives for another human being," Marchetti said quietly. "There's a difference." He didn't wait for further argument. He made a stretcher from the truck's canvas cover and 2 pieces of wood. They loaded Thomas onto it as carefully as they could, though every movement made him gasp with pain. Then they picked up what water they could carry, took a few tins of food from the scattered supplies, and started walking west. Away from British lines. Away from their own lines. Into a desert that didn't care who won the battle or why a group of Italian soldiers had decided that saving an enemy's life mattered more than following orders. They walked through heat that felt like walking through fire. The stretcher was heavy. Thomas was slight, maybe 65 kilograms, but the canvas and wood added weight, and carrying anything for miles in desert heat turned even light loads into torture. They took turns, 2 men on the stretcher while the others walked ahead or behind, watching for patrols. Every hour they stopped briefly, gave Thomas small amounts of water, checked his wound, and tried not to think about how exposed they were. The landscape offered almost nothing. Flat sand broken occasionally by rock formations or wadis that provided temporary shade but no real safety. In every direction, the horizon shimmered with heat that turned distance into liquid, made the world feel like something melting at the edges. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he seemed confused about why Italian soldiers were carrying him. When he was unconscious, his breathing became worryingly shallow, his face taking on a waxy pallor that suggested his body was fighting infections his immune system couldn't defeat without help. "He's dying," Alberto said matter-of-factly on the second day. "We're carrying a corpse." "Then we're carrying a corpse," Marchetti replied. "But until he actually dies, we keep moving." They were heading west-northwest, trying to reach what Marchetti hoped were Italian fallback positions. The battle had moved so quickly that maps were useless. Entire divisions had been scattered. Communication was gone. For all he knew, there were no Italian lines left to reach. On the 3rd day they ran out of water. Not completely, they'd been rationing strictly, giving most of it to Thomas, whose wound seemed to leak fluid faster than they could replace it. But what remained wouldn't last more than a day, and they hadn't seen any sign of civilization, any hint of a well or oasis. Giovanni was the first to show serious signs of dehydration. He stumbled while carrying the stretcher, nearly dropping Thomas before Domenico caught the other end. That night, Giovanni couldn't keep down the small amount of water they gave him. "We're not going to make it," Alberto said. Not angry anymore. Just tired and resigned. Marchetti sat beside the stretcher watching Thomas breathe. The British soldier's eyes were closed, but he was conscious. Marchetti could tell by the way his fingers occasionally twitched, grasping at consciousness the way a drowning man grasps at water. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas's voice was so quiet Marchetti almost didn't hear it. "Doing what?" "Carrying me. Wasting your water. Risking your lives." Marchetti was quiet for a long time. In the distance, a jackal called, the sound carrying across the empty desert with startling clarity. "When I was a boy," Marchetti finally said, "my grandfather told me a story. During the First War he was at Caporetto when the Austrians broke through. The retreat was chaos. Men were dying everywhere. And my grandfather found an Austrian soldier in a crater, wounded, alone. He could have left him. Should have left him. The Austrians were killing Italians by the thousands. But he didn't. He stayed with that soldier until stretcher bearers found them. Probably saved his life." Thomas's eyes opened slightly. "Why did he do it?" "I asked him that once. He said because when you stop seeing your enemy as human, you stop being human yourself. The war took everything from him. His friends, his faith in God, his belief that life had meaning. But it didn't take his humanity. That was the one thing he refused to let them have. Your grandfather, sounds like, good man. He died when I was 12. But I remembered the story." Thomas managed a slight nod. "So, you're doing this, for him?" "No," Marchetti said softly. "I'm doing this because if I leave you here to die, I become the person I swore I'd never become. And I'd rather die carrying you than live knowing I walked away." Alberto was listening from a few meters away. In the darkness, Marchetti couldn't see his face, but he heard the soldier's breathing change, heard something that might have been understanding starting to break through anger and exhaustion. Dawn came cold and gray. They started walking again because stopping meant dying slightly faster. The stretcher felt heavier than yesterday. Everyone's lips were cracked and bleeding. Dehydration was making them clumsy, making thoughts slow and disconnected. Around midday Giovanni collapsed. He didn't stumble. Didn't gradually weaken. He simply stopped walking and fell forward into the sand. When they rolled him over, his eyes were half open and unfocused. His breathing was fast and shallow, hyperventilation that meant his body was trying to compensate for what it couldn't compensate for anymore. "We need water," Domenico said desperately. "He needs water now." They had maybe half a liter left. Marchetti gave it all to Giovanni, pouring it slowly into his mouth, watching most of it spill down his chin because his swallowing reflex was starting to fail. "Sergeant," Alberto said quietly, we have to leave them. Both of them. Or we all die here." Marchetti looked at Thomas on the stretcher, barely conscious. At Giovanni in the sand, his body starting to shut down. At his 3 remaining soldiers, all of them showing signs of advanced dehydration. Alberto was right. Strategically, tactically, rationally, he was absolutely right. Abandoning the wounded would give the rest of them a chance to reach some kind of help. Continuing to carry them guaranteed that everyone died. But Marchetti found he couldn't do it. "We rest here," he said. "In the shade of that outcropping. We rest until evening, then we move again." "Sergeant." "We don't abandon our people, Alberto. Not Thomas. Not Giovanni. We carry them or we die trying. Those are the options." They rested in shade that barely qualified as shade. The sun moved across the sky with terrible slowness. Giovanni's breathing grew worse. Thomas had stopped responding entirely, his pulse threadbare and irregular. The desert was silent except for wind moving across sand. No aircraft. No artillery. No indication that a war was happening anywhere in the world. They might as well have been the last people alive, dying slowly in a landscape that would bury them and forget they existed. Marchetti closed his eyes. He thought about home. About his wife, who he hadn't seen in 2 years. About his grandfather, who had carried an Austrian soldier to safety and never questioned whether it was worth it. He thought about what it meant to be human in a place that seemed designed to strip away humanity. When he opened his eyes, the sun was lower. They had maybe 3 hours before darkness. 3 hours to either die here or die moving. The choice felt less like a choice than an acknowledgement of fate. "On your feet," he said softly. "We move." They lifted Giovanni first, using the last of their strength to get him onto Alberto's back. Then they lifted the stretcher. Marchetti took the front. Domenico took the rear. And they started walking west again. Toward nothing. Toward hope that was more memory than reality. Toward whatever waited in a desert that had no mercy and no meaning beyond what they chose to create in it. They found the well by accident. Or maybe it found them. Later, Marchetti would never be entirely sure which. They had been walking for hours after sunset, using the stars to navigate, moving in a dreamlike state where exhaustion and dehydration blurred the line between consciousness and hallucination. Domenico saw it first. A depression in the earth. A structure that might have been natural, might have been man-made. They approached it carefully, expecting nothing, hoping for everything. It was a well. Ancient, probably Bedouin, the stonework worn smooth by centuries of wind and hands. And when Marchetti dropped a stone into it, he heard, after a long, terrible pause, the splash of water. They rigged a rope from their equipment. Lowered the canvas that had been Thomas's stretcher, weighted with rocks. Pulled up water that tasted of minerals and earth but was water, was life, was the difference between dying tonight and surviving until tomorrow. Giovanni drank first. Slowly, carefully, small sips that his body could actually absorb. Color returned to his face gradually, like watching someone come back from death in slow motion. He vomited twice, but the third time the water stayed down. Thomas drank next. His eyes flickered open, focusing on Marchetti's face with something approaching recognition. "Still alive," Thomas whispered. "Still alive," Marchetti confirmed. They stayed at the well for 2 days. Recovered enough strength to walk. Cleaned Thomas's wound as best they could, though infection had set in deep and there was nothing they could do about it without proper medical supplies. But the water kept them alive, and being alive meant having a chance. On the 3rd day they saw the smoke. 3 pillars rising in the distance, black against the pale morning sky. Smoke meant people. Meant either salvation or capture or death, depending on whose people they were. They approached carefully. What they found was a small Italian supply depot that had been hastily abandoned. Trucks sat empty, fuel tanks ruptured. Supply crates lay scattered in the sand, their contents partially looted. And around it all, the signs of hasty evacuation, papers blowing in the wind, equipment left behind, the smell of burned documents. But there was something else. Medical supplies. An entire crate, somehow overlooked in the evacuation. Bandages, antiseptics, morphine, antibiotics, everything they needed to give Thomas an actual chance at survival. Marchetti worked carefully, using water from their canteens to clean the wound, applying sulfa powder to fight infection, rebandaging with clean gauze. Thomas gritted his teeth through the pain, his fingers white where he gripped a piece of wood Domenico had given him. When it was done, Thomas lay back in the sand, his breathing slightly easier, his face still pale but no longer carrying the gray tint of impending death. "You could have left me," he said. "At the truck. In the desert. You could have left me a dozen times." "Yes," Marchetti agreed. "Why didn't you?" Marchetti thought about the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for days, through every kilometer of carrying weight they couldn't spare, through the moment when Giovanni had collapsed, through the nights when he'd been certain they would all die. Because you're not my enemy, Thomas. You never were. You're some other soldier's enemy. Some politician's enemy. Some general's enemy. But you're not mine. You're just a person who got hurt in a place where people get hurt, and I couldn't walk away from that. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, what happens now? Now we find British lines. We surrender properly. We make sure you get to a field hospital. And then? Marchetti shrugged. Then we become prisoners of war and the war ends for us. You'll be treated well, Thomas said. The British, we don't. I know. Your grandfather probably told you the same stories mine told me. They rested at the depot for another day. Found food in the abandoned supplies. Found maps that showed British positions had advanced far beyond where they thought. The Axis army was in full retreat now, streaming back toward Tunisia, the North African campaign effectively over. On the morning they prepared to move again, Alberto approached Marchetti. I was wrong, he said simply. About leaving them. About thinking it didn't matter. I was wrong and I'm sorry. Marchetti clasped his shoulder. You were trying to keep us alive. That's not wrong. But you were trying to keep us human. That matters more. They walked east this time. Toward British lines. Thomas could walk now, slowly, supported by Giovanni on one side and Domenico on the other. They made maybe 5 kilometers a day, but it was enough. 3 days later they crested a rise and saw British tents spread across a valley below. A field hospital. Supply trucks. Soldiers moving with the relaxed confidence of men who knew they'd won. This is it, Marchetti said quietly. They walked down the slope slowly, hands raised, weapons left behind. British sentries spotted them immediately, raising rifles, shouting challenges. Thomas stepped forward, still unsteady, still weak, but standing on his own. These men are Italian soldiers surrendering under my protection, he called out in English. They found me wounded and carried me across the desert for a week. They saved my life. They need medical attention and they need to be treated with respect. The British sergeant who approached looked confused, then skeptical. Then, as he examined Thomas's wound and heard the story, something approaching respect crossed his face. Right then, he said. Medical tent is that way. All of you. And someone get word to the colonel. He'll want to hear this. As they walked toward the medical tent, Thomas turned to Marchetti. Will they treat you well? The British? Well enough, Marchetti said. Better than we treated our prisoners probably. Better than the Germans would have treated you. I'm going to tell them what you did. Everyone. I'm going to make sure they know. That's not necessary. Yes it is. Because when this war ends, people are going to want to remember only the terrible things. The bombs and the killing and the reasons we learned to hate each other. But they need to remember this too. They need to know that even in the middle of all that death, humanity survived. That some Italian sergeant decided a British life mattered more than following orders or staying safe. Marchetti smiled tiredly. I'm no hero, Thomas. I just did what my grandfather would have done. Maybe, Thomas replied. But that makes you more than most men can claim. They reached the medical tent. British doctors immediately took Thomas inside while Marchetti and his men were escorted to a separate area for processing. The last thing Marchetti saw was Thomas turning back, raising one hand in farewell, his eyes carrying something that looked like gratitude but felt like something deeper. Like recognition that in a war designed to make enemies of strangers, 2 strangers had discovered they were never enemies at all. The British POW camp at Cairo was nothing like what Italian propaganda had promised. There were no torture chambers. No starvation rations. No brutality beyond the basic indignity of being confined. The guards were professional. The food was adequate. Medical care was provided without question. It was, in almost every respect, humane imprisonment, which made it surreal. Marchetti and his men were processed, deloused, given clean clothes, and assigned to a barracks that held maybe 50 other Italian soldiers. Most of them looked better now than they had in months of fighting, cleaner, healthier, less haunted. Is this what we were fighting? Giovanni wondered aloud their first night there. These people who give us beds and food and medical care? Nobody had an answer. The camp routine was simple. Morning roll call. Work details, nothing brutal, mostly maintenance and construction projects. Meals 3 times a day. Evening free time where prisoners could write letters, play cards, or simply sit and try to make sense of what their lives had become. Marchetti wrote to his wife. The letter was censored, so he kept it simple. He was alive. He was uninjured. He was being treated well. He missed her. He hoped the war would end soon so he could come home. He didn't mention Thomas. Didn't mention carrying a wounded enemy across the desert. Didn't mention the choice that had redefined what he understood about duty. Some things couldn't be explained in letters that would be read by censors. 2 weeks after their arrival, Marchetti was called to the commandant's office. He went expecting punishment for some infraction he wasn't aware of committing. Instead, he found a British colonel waiting with Thomas Webb, now recovered enough to walk without assistance, his uniform clean and pressed. "Sergeant Marchetti," the colonel said in perfect Italian. "Private Webb has told me a rather extraordinary story. I'd like to hear your version." Marchetti told it simply. The wounded soldier. The choice to help. The journey across the desert. The well that had saved them all. He left out the philosophical debates with himself, the moments of doubt, the times he'd questioned his own decision. The colonel listened without interrupting. When Marchetti finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "You realize you could have left him to die and no one would have questioned it? You were trying to reach your own lines. You had wounded of your own to care for. By any military standard, your decision was questionable." "Yes, sir." "And yet you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." The colonel nodded slowly. "Private Webb has requested that your actions be formally recognized. He's also requested that you and your men be given certain privileges within the camp. Better quarters, lighter work details, additional correspondence privileges. I'm prepared to grant these requests." Marchetti looked at Thomas, who was standing quietly near the window, his expression unreadable. "That's not necessary," Marchetti said. "We don't need special treatment." "Perhaps not," the colonel replied. "But you deserve it nonetheless. What you did was extraordinary, Sergeant. And in a war that has produced far too little extraordinary humanity, it deserves to be recognized." They were moved to better quarters. The other prisoners noticed but didn't resent it. Word had spread about what they'd done, and in the strange moral economy of a POW camp, saving an enemy's life bought considerable respect. Thomas visited when he could, bringing small luxuries, British cigarettes, chocolate, once a bottle of wine he'd somehow acquired. They would sit in the evening shade and talk about things that had nothing to do with war. Thomas spoke about his home in Yorkshire, about the girl he'd been writing to since before the war, about plans for a future that had seemed impossible when he was bleeding in the desert. "I'm going to marry her," Thomas said one evening. "Sarah. As soon as I get back. I'm not waiting anymore." "Good," Marchetti replied. "Life is too short to wait for perfect timing. Will you go back to your wife? After the war? If she'll have me. I've been gone a long time. People change." "She'll have you," Thomas said with certainty. "Because you're the kind of man who carries wounded enemies across deserts. That's the kind of man worth waiting for." The war continued without them. They heard reports through guards and Red Cross officials. The Axis had been pushed completely out of Egypt. Allied forces had landed in French North Africa. Rommel was retreating toward Tunisia. The North African campaign that had once seemed like it might change the course of the war was ending in defeat. But none of it seemed to matter much inside the camp. The war had become an abstraction, something happening to other people in other places. What mattered was the present, staying healthy, staying sane, finding small ways to maintain dignity in captivity. The Italian prisoners formed a kind of community. They organized classes, language lessons, mathematics, history. They put on theatrical performances using costumes made from whatever they could scavenge. They created elaborate gardens using seeds saved from their meals, turning sections of desert into small patches of green that felt like defiance against everything that had tried to destroy them. Marchetti taught English to anyone who wanted to learn. Giovanni taught music, having discovered an old guitar somewhere and managed to restore it to playability. Alberto, who had once been angry about everything, became the camp's unofficial mediator, settling disputes before they escalated. They were becoming people again. Not soldiers. Not enemies. Just people trying to survive captivity and preserve something of themselves for whatever came after. One evening, nearly a year after their surrender, Thomas arrived looking unusually serious. "I'm being transferred," he said without preamble. "Back to England. Medical discharge. The wound never healed properly, and they say I won't be fit for active duty again." "You're going home," Marchetti said. "I'm going home." Thomas sat down heavily. "And I don't know how to say goodbye to the man who saved my life." "You say thank you and you go live the life you wanted to live. You marry Sarah. You have children. You get old and tell them stories about the war, and maybe, if you think they can understand it, you tell them about the Italian sergeant who decided your life was worth saving." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Will I ever see you again?" "I don't know. The war has to end first. Then there's reconstruction, repatriation. It could be years. If you ever come to England, I'll find you," Marchetti promised. "And you can buy me that drink you've been promising." They shook hands. Then, surprising them both, they embraced, briefly, awkwardly, the way men do when emotion outpaces their ability to express it. Thomas left the next day. Marchetti watched the truck drive away, taking with it a friendship that shouldn't have existed but did, that had been forged in a desert that had tried to kill them both. The war continued. The Italians surrendered. Mussolini fell. Allied forces invaded Sicily, then the mainland. The Third Reich began its long, terrible collapse. And through it all, Marchetti remained in the camp, waiting for news. Waiting for the war to end. waiting to go home to a life that felt increasingly like something that had happened to someone else. But he had Thomas's address, written on a scrap of paper he kept in his pocket. And he had a story that no one would believe, but that was absolutely true. A story about how, in the middle of hell, two men from opposite sides discovered they were on the same side after all. The side that chose humanity when everything else chose violence. May 1945. The war was over. Victory in Europe came in newspaper headlines that felt surreal to men who'd been fighting for years. Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed into ruins. Across Europe, people were celebrating in the streets, crying tears of joy and relief, trying to believe that the nightmare was finally finished. In the Cairo POW camp, the Italian prisoners reacted with quiet relief. Not jubilation. They'd been on the losing side, and going home meant returning to a country that had been devastated by war, occupation, and civil conflict. But the war was over. That meant something. Maybe it meant everything. Repatriation took months. The British had more important priorities than shipping Italian POWs back to Italy quickly. There were displaced persons to care for, concentration camp survivors to feed, entire cities to rebuild. So the prisoners waited, and waiting became one more thing they'd learned to do well. Marchetti received a letter in July. His wife was alive. Their house had survived. She was waiting for him to come home. The relief was so intense it made his hands shake as he read her words. For 3 years he hadn't known. Hadn't been certain. The war had swallowed communications along with everything else. They shipped out in September, loaded onto transport ships that carried hundreds of Italian prisoners across the Mediterranean toward Italy. Marchetti stood at the rail, watching the African coast recede into the distance. He thought about the desert. About Thomas. About the choice he'd made that had seemed so simple in the moment and so complicated in retrospect. He wondered if it had mattered. If saving one British soldier's life had changed anything. The war had been fought regardless. Millions had died regardless. The outcome would have been the same whether Thomas Webb had bled out beside that truck or survived to go home to Yorkshire. But then he thought about Thomas marrying Sarah. About children who would be born because their father had survived. About a future that existed because an Italian sergeant had decided an enemy's life was worth saving. Maybe it had mattered after all. Not to the war. But to something more important than the war. Italy was both familiar and foreign. The cities had been bombed. The infrastructure was damaged. The economy had collapsed. People were hungry, tired, trying to rebuild from rubble. Fascism was gone, replaced by a democratic government that was still figuring out how to govern. But it was home. Marchetti reunited with his wife in their kitchen. She looked older. He looked older. 3 years of war had aged them both in ways that had nothing to do with chronology. They held each other without speaking, and the silence said everything that needed to be said. Life resumed slowly. Marchetti found work in construction. Italy needed rebuilding, and there was no shortage of jobs for men who could work with their hands. The pay was poor, but it was work, and work meant dignity, meant purpose, meant something to do besides think about the war. He didn't talk about the desert. His wife never asked. She understood, the way spouses of soldiers often understand, that some things are too difficult to put into words, that silence is sometimes the kindest gift you can give someone who's been through hell. Years passed. Italy recovered, slowly, unevenly, but definitely. The Marshall Plan brought American aid. The economy stabilized. Cities were rebuilt. The generation that had fought the war began having children, and those children grew up in a world where fascism was history and democracy was the present. Marchetti kept Thomas's address in a drawer beside his bed. Sometimes he would take it out and look at it, wondering if he should write, wondering if Thomas remembered, wondering if trying to reconnect with that moment in the desert would somehow diminish it or change it into something less meaningful. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, he finally wrote. The letter was simple. I survived. I came home. I think of you often and hope you're well. If you're ever in Italy, you know where to find me. He mailed it without really expecting a response. The war was a long time ago. People moved on. Memories faded. Thomas had probably moved on with his life, built a family, become someone who thought about the war only occasionally when something reminded him. 3 weeks later he received a reply. Vittorio? I think of you often as well. More than often, really. Sarah and I have 2 children now, a boy and a girl. I named my son David, but I tell him stories about a man named Vittorio who saved my life in the desert. He's too young to understand yet, but someday he will. I'm a schoolteacher now. History, ironically. I teach children about the war, and I try to make them understand that it wasn't about heroes and villains. It was about people making choices in impossible circumstances. Some chose violence. Some chose mercy. You chose mercy, and because of that, I'm here to teach these children. I would very much like to see you again. Sarah and I have been talking about visiting Italy. If we come, may we stay with you? With gratitude, Thomas. They visited in the summer of 1953. Thomas and Sarah and 2 children who were curious about everything and afraid of nothing. They stayed for 2 weeks in Marchetti's modest house, and every evening after the children were in bed, Thomas and Marchetti would sit in the garden and talk. Not always about the war. Sometimes about teaching. About construction. About the ordinary concerns of ordinary people living ordinary lives. But sometimes, inevitably, they would talk about the desert. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked one evening. Carrying me instead of leaving me? You nearly died. Your men nearly died. You could have just left me and saved yourselves. Marchetti was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars that were clearer here than they'd been in Cairo, clearer than almost anywhere else he'd been. No, he finally said. I've never regretted it. Because regret would mean wishing you were dead, and I've never wished that. Not once. But it was dangerous. Everything was dangerous. Staying at the truck was dangerous. Walking away was dangerous. The entire war was dangerous. But walking away would have cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. What? The belief that I was still a good man. That the war hadn't turned me into someone who could look at another human being dying and feel nothing. I needed to help you to prove to myself that I was still the person my grandfather taught me to be. Thomas nodded slowly. So you saved me to save yourself. Maybe. Or maybe we saved each other. You gave me the opportunity to be human in a place that was trying to make me inhuman. That's worth something. Sarah joined them then, bringing wine, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But later, as they were preparing for bed, Thomas said quietly, Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to be better than the circumstances demand. You would have done the same, Marchetti said. I'd like to think so, but I don't know. And that's the difference between us. You did it. I just like to think I would have. The Webb family left 2 weeks later. They embraced at the train station, and the children waved from the windows as the train pulled away, carrying them back toward England, back toward lives that existed because an Italian sergeant had decided an enemy soldier's life was worth saving. Marchetti never saw Thomas again. They exchanged letters twice a year, Christmas and birthdays. The letters grew shorter as the years passed, as life demanded more attention and the past became something you remembered rather than something you lived. Thomas died in 1979 of heart failure. Sarah sent Marchetti a letter informing him. In it she wrote, He talked about you until the end. About what you did. About what it meant to him. Thank you for giving me 40 years with a man I loved. Thank you for giving our children a father. Thank you for being proof that humanity can survive anything. Marchetti kept that letter until his own death 12 years later in 1991. His children found it when they were sorting through his things, along with Thomas's address on that scrap of paper, carefully preserved for nearly 50 years. They never fully understood what it meant. Their father had never talked about the war. Had never told them about carrying a wounded British soldier across the desert, about choosing mercy when orders demanded otherwise. But they found the letters. And slowly, piecing together fragments, they reconstructed the story. The wounded enemy. The impossible choice. The journey that should have killed them all but didn't. The friendship that should never have existed but did. And they understood, finally, what their father had always known but never said. That the war had tried to make him into something terrible and he had refused. That he had chosen to remain human when remaining human would have been easier to abandon. That he had saved a life not because it was strategic or smart or likely to change the outcome of anything, but because it was the right thing to do. And that had made all the difference. There's a photograph. It sits in a museum in London now, part of an exhibition about ordinary acts of humanity during World War II. The photograph shows two old men, one Italian, one British, sitting in a garden in Italy, wine glasses in hand, smiling at the camera with the comfortable ease of old friends. The caption identifies them, Vittorio Marchetti, Italian Army, and Thomas Webb, British Army. It tells the basic facts of the story, the encounter in the desert, the journey, the survival. What it doesn't capture, because photographs never can, is what that moment meant. In 2015, 70 years after the war ended, Thomas Webb's grandson traveled to Italy. His name was David, named for his uncle but carrying his grandfather's middle name, Thomas David Webb. He was a journalist researching his family history, trying to understand the war generation before they disappeared entirely into memory. He found Marchetti's house, now occupied by Vittorio's daughter, herself in her 70s. She invited him in, offered coffee, and listened as he explained who he was and why he'd come. My grandfather told me stories, David said. About an Italian sergeant who saved his life. About a journey across the desert that shouldn't have ended with anyone surviving. He talked about it until the day he died. It shaped everything about how he saw the world. Vittorio's daughter, her name was Isabella, smiled softly. My father never talked about the war. But after he died we found the letters. Dozens of them. And we finally understood why he'd spent his whole life trying to be a good man, why he'd insisted that we treat everyone with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She brought out a box. Inside were the letters, carefully preserved. Thomas's address on its scrap of paper. Photographs from the 1953 visit. A medal the British government had sent Marchetti in 1960, recognizing his actions. a medal he'd never worn, never displayed, had kept in a drawer because he'd never thought what he did deserved recognition. "May I ask you something?" David said. "Why did he do it?" The war was over for them. They were trying to survive. Helping my grandfather made their survival less likely. Why did he choose to risk everything for an enemy? Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then, I asked my father that once, near the end of his life. He said it wasn't complicated. He said he'd been taught that every person you meet is either someone you help or someone you fail. And he'd failed too many people during the war, people he couldn't save, orders he had to follow, choices that weren't really choices. Your grandfather was someone he could help. So he did. That simple? That simple. And that difficult. Because simple moral clarity in the middle of war is the hardest thing to maintain. They talked for hours. Isabella showed David the letters, the photographs, the accumulated fragments of a friendship that had spanned decades and survived a war that had tried to make friendship between former enemies impossible. Before David left, Isabella gave him something. It was the medal the British government had sent Marchetti. "Your grandfather should have this," she said. "Or his family should. My father would want you to have it." "I can't." "You can. Because what your grandfather and my father created wasn't just between them. It was for everyone who came after. It was proof that even in the worst circumstances humanity doesn't have to fail. That's a legacy worth sharing." David accepted the medal. He wrote about the story in The Guardian and the article went viral. People shared it millions of times, each of them responding to something essential in the narrative. The idea that mercy was possible even in war, that enemies could become friends, that one person's choice could ripple across generations. The BBC made a documentary. Italian television covered it. Students wrote essays about it. The story became one of those rare historical accounts that transcended its specifics and became something universal. A reminder that humanity persists, even when everything conspires to destroy it. But the real legacy wasn't in museums or newspaper articles or documentaries. It was in Thomas's son David, who became a doctor and spent his career treating refugees from war zones, carrying his father's belief that every life was worth saving. It was in Marchetti's grandson, who became a teacher and spent his career teaching children about moral courage and the choices that define who we become. It was in the hundreds of thousands of people who read the story and thought about their own lives, their own choices, their own opportunities to choose mercy over convenience, humanity over expediency. The war had tried to make Vittorio Marchetti into a killer. Had given him every reason to abandon Thomas Webb to die in the desert. Had structured every incentive to prioritize his own survival over the survival of an enemy. And he had refused. Not dramatically. Not with speeches or grand gestures. But quietly, simply by making the decision that seemed obvious to him even when it should have been impossible. That another human's life was worth saving, regardless of which uniform they wore or which side of the war they fought on. That refusal had ripples. Thomas lived. Had children. Those children had children. Today there are dozens of people alive who exist because an Italian sergeant decided a British soldier's life mattered. But beyond the directly measurable impacts, there was something else. A story that proved what people needed to prove, that they weren't helpless against the worst impulses of war, that individual choice still mattered, that mercy was always possible even when everything suggested it was impossible. The desert had tried to kill them. The war had tried to make them enemies. The circumstances had conspired to make abandonment the logical choice. And one man had simply said no. That's the legacy. Not heroism. Marchetti would have hated being called a hero. Not even exceptional courage. He would have insisted he was simply doing what anyone should do. Just a quiet, persistent refusal to let war make him into someone he couldn't live with being. That refusal saved Thomas Webb's life. And maybe, in a way that's harder to measure but no less real, it saved Vittorio Marchetti's soul. The photograph sits in the museum still. Two old men in a garden, smiling. Behind them, invisible but present, stretches the desert where they nearly died together. Before them, invisible but present, stretched the generations who inherited their story. And in the space between what was and what came after, there's a simple truth that the war tried very hard to obscure but could never quite destroy. That humanity is a choice. Not a given. Not something that happens automatically or that can be taken for granted. A choice that has to be made again and again, in circumstances large and small, until the choices accumulate into something called character. Vittorio Marchetti made that choice in a desert in 1942, and 70 years later, people are still talking about it. Not because it was extraordinary, though it was. Not because it was unique, though in a war characterized by dehumanization, any act of humanity felt unique. But because it was proof. Proof that even in hell, some people refuse to become demons. That even when everything argues for abandonment, some people insist on carrying the weight. That even when the war does everything in its power to make you forget that your enemy is human, some people remember anyway. And that memory, that insistence, that refusal, it matters more than strategy, more than tactics, more than the battles that fill history books. Because wars end. Countries recover. Borders change and armies dissolve, and the reasons people fought become footnotes in history books. But the choice to be human in inhuman circumstances, that echoes, that never ends. That becomes the story we tell ourselves when we need to believe that we're capable of being better than our worst moments, that mercy is possible even when everything argues against it, that one person's decision can ripple across generations and change the world in ways both measurable and impossible to measure. Two men in a desert. One wounded. One facing an impossible choice. And from that moment, an entire legacy of humanity that refused to die just because someone started a war. The photograph doesn't capture all of that. Photographs never do. But if you know where to look, if you understand what you're seeing, you can see it anyway. Two men who should have been enemies, who became friends instead. Who proved, in the process, that humanity is always a choice, and that sometimes, against all odds, people choose correctly. That's the legacy. That's what remains. Long after the battles are forgotten and the strategies debated and the borders redrawn, that remains. One Italian sergeant who looked at a dying British soldier and decided that mercy mattered more than orders, that humanity mattered more than sides, that life mattered more than the war that was trying to take it. He carried that soldier across a desert. And in doing so, he carried something more important than either of them. The proof that even in the darkest places, even in the middle of hell itself, the best parts of humanity can survive if someone is brave enough to insist on it. Vittorio Marchetti insisted. And the world is better because he did.